Imagine walking down a busy city street wearing $1,000 suit, your mind consumed by business deals. Your body surrounded by assistants and reporters, and out of nowhere, a little girl in dirty clothes clutches your leg, looks up at you with wide, innocent eyes, and calls you daddy. Now imagine that you're not a father, at least not officially, not that you know of. This is exactly what happened to Leo, a young tech billionaire known for his ruthless business strategies, sharp intellect, and cold emotional detachment. Leo wasn't the type of man to be caught off guard, but this one moment shattered the emotional armor he had spent years building. The girl Daisy was no ordinary child. She didn't cry or whimper. She looked him straight in the eyes and with a voice that held equal parts desperation and charm, asked if she could stay with him. And for a second the world paused, not because of the spectacle, but because of the overwhelming authenticity in her eyes. Now let's break this down. Imagine being in Leo's shoes for a moment. You've climbed the corporate ladder, carved a name for yourself in a cutthroat industry, built empires, and walked away from relationships because you believed love was a liability. Now a child who resembles a woman you left behind years ago stands before you, challenging everything you thought you knew about your past and your priorities. As the crowd murmured and his PR team panicked, Leo knelt down and asked who she was. Her name was Daisy, and she was smarter than her years, streetwise, witty, and quick to smile despite her torn dress and tired eyes. And when a vendor stormed over claiming Daisy had broken a few eggs without paying, the little girl pointed to Leo and said, "He's my dad, he'll pay." And Leo, to everyone's surprise, pulled out a wad of cash and handed it over without hesitation. Now here's where the story turns from bizarre to profound. Leo couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen those eyes before, not just in a dream or a photograph, but in someone he had once loved. Faith, the woman he left years ago after she told him she was pregnant with his child. Back then, Leo had made a choice that many ambitious people make. He chose his future over his present, his career over his conscience, his ambition over his affection. He convinced himself she would be fine, that it wasn't his responsibility, and that any connection to that unborn child would only weigh him down. But now, looking at Daisy, that decision began to haunt him. And this is a critical point in many people's lives, the moment when the consequences of past choices return, not to punish us, but to offer a second chance. A chance to do better, to be better, to choose differently. And Leo took it. He asked his assistant to find out everything about Daisy, where she lived, who she stayed with, and whether this was a scam or something far more real. What they discovered was heartbreaking. Daisy lived in a slum not far from the city center, in a small one-room shack with a sick woman who was clearly dying. And that woman was Faith, the very same woman Leo had left behind. And when he entered the room for the first time in nearly a decade, their eyes met, and the silence was louder than any words. Faith didn't cry or scream. She simply said, "You made your choice years ago, and I made mine. I raised our daughter the best I could without you, and now she's all I have." Leo stood there unable to speak, not because he didn't have words, but because he didn't have the right words. And sometimes silence is the only honest response when we come face to face with the damage our choices have caused. And here's where we pause and reflect how many of us have people in our past who we left behind, not out of cruelty, but out of fear or ambition or misunderstanding. And what would it take to reach out to them, not for redemption, but for responsibility? Back in that tiny room, Leo watched as Daisy cared for her mother, feeding her, wiping her brow, telling her silly stories, and all Leo could see was the strength of a child who had every reason to be broken, but chose joy instead. He realized then that love isn't always loud. It isn't always clean. Sometimes love is a child walking 3 miles to sell plastic bottles to buy rice for dinner. Sometimes love is staying even when everyone else leaves. And in that moment, Leo didn't see a street girl or a mistake from his past. He saw his daughter, and he decided he wouldn't leave again. He moved them to a private hospital, paid for everything, and stayed with Faith through the night, holding her hand as Daisy slept curled up on a couch nearby. And when the doctors said Faith needed long-term care, Leo didn't hesitate. He signed the papers, made the calls, and set up everything she would need. Because sometimes the greatest act of love isn't words or gifts or promises. It's simply showing up and staying. And that's what he did. He stayed. And as the days passed, Daisy began to open up, slowly testing him, asking him hard questions about why he left and why he was back. And Leo answered honestly, without sugarcoating, without deflecting. He told her he was scared and selfish and wrong, and Daisy didn't forgive him right away. But she listened, and sometimes listening is the first step toward healing. And through it all, Faith watched quietly, letting her daughter decide whether Leo deserved a place in their lives, and it's important too. Note here that real forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering and choosing to move forward anyway. And that's what made Faith's strength so remarkable. She didn't hide her pain. She didn't pretend she wasn't angry. She just didn't let it define her. And eventually she invited Leo to their home, not as a guest, but as a father. And that invitation changed everything. The drive to Daisy's old neighborhood was unlike any ride Leo had ever taken in his luxury car. The familiar hum of the engine seemed out of place against the backdrop of crumbling buildings, narrow alleyways, and makeshift markets. The chauffeur hesitated, unsure if they were going the right way. But Leo gave a nod and said, "Keep going." He wasn't just on a journey through traffic. He was navigating through the consequences of his own past decisions. When they reached the alley where Daisy used to live, a group of neighborhood kids watched with wide eyes as the billionaire stepped out, holding Daisy's hand. And for the first time, Leo saw the place not as a slum, but as the setting of his daughter's earliest memories, and that realization broke something open in him. Because this wasn't just about reuniting with Daisy or making amends with Faith, it was about understanding the life they had built without him, and how that life had shaped the beautiful, bold girl now skipping beside him. The neighbors were cautious but not unfriendly. They had watched Faith struggle and admired her resilience. And now they watched as this well-dressed man bent down to greet the elders, offered respectful nods, and asked about the community. And here's where we draw a powerful real-life parallel. There's a story of a man named Tom in Chicago who discovered after a DNA test that he had a 14-year-old daughter he never knew about, rather than simply send money or apologize. Tom chose to move to her city, take a job nearby, and slowly build a relationship that respected her mother's efforts and his daughter's boundaries. Today, they run a nonprofit together focused on fatherless youth. This mirrors Leo's path because redemption isn't about replacing what was lost. It's about honoring what was endured. And as Leo spent time with Faith and Daisy, he learned about every missed birthday, every scraped knee, every night Faith had stayed awake praying for strength. And when he offered her the option of moving into his mansion, Faith hesitated. It wasn't pride. It was protection. She didn't want Daisy uprooted again, only to be hurt if Leo changed his mind. But Daisy was the one who said, "I want to see where you live, Daddy." And that innocent request carried more weight than any contract or promise. So they moved carefully, not out of desperation, but cautious hope. And stepping into Leo's home was like entering a different world. Daisy's eyes widened at the marble floors and chandeliers, but instead of being overwhelmed, she marched straight into the living room and asked, "Do you have cartoons here?" And that was the beginning of something real. Leo didn't try to impress her with toys or tech. He learned how to braid her hair badly. He learned which bedtime stories made her laugh and which ones made her cry, and he made mistakes forgetting the snacks she liked or talking too much business at dinner. But he kept trying, and that made all the difference. And Faith observed it all from a distance, at first still skeptical, still protecting her heart, and who could blame her after years of carrying everything alone? Trusting didn't come easy, but slowly she began to relax. Not because Leo said the right things, but because he did the right things, like attending Daisy's school recital, even though he had a board meeting, or spending Sunday mornings making pancakes instead of flying to another city. And one night as they sat together on the porch, Faith told him, "I still don't know if I can forgive you, but I can see you're different, and that matters." And Leo nodded, knowing that healing doesn't come with deadlines, and love doesn't come with guarantees. And here's a truth we often overlook. People don't need us to be perfect. They need us to be present, consistently, gently, and sincerely. One afternoon, Daisy came home crying. Another student had mocked her old clothes and called her a charity case. Leo's first instinct was to storm into the school to demand justice, but Faith stopped him. She said, "Let me handle this." And instead, she sat Daisy down, looked her in the eye, and said, "You are not your clothes, you are your courage." And Daisy wiped her tears and said, "I'm going to write a poem about this." And she did, and it won an award that year because strength born from pain often becomes art that inspires. And Leo learned then that being a father wasn't about shielding Daisy from every hardship. It was about standing with her through each one. And as time passed, Faith grew stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. She returned to her nursing job part-time, reconnected with friends, started smiling more, and one evening she joined Leo and Daisy on the rooftop for dinner and laughed louder than she had in years, and Leo watched her. Eyes twinkle in the candlelight and realized he was falling in love all over again. But this time not with a fantasy or a memory, but with the woman who had fought through fire and emerged stronger, not in spite of it, but because of it. And one day Leo asked her, "What do you need from me, really?" And Faith looked at him and said, "I need you to be someone our daughter can count on, even when things get messy." And that single sentence became Leo's compass, guiding his every decision, every action, every moment. And soon Daisy began drawing pictures of their family with three stick figures labeled Mommy, Daddy, and Me. And one night, as she showed Leo her newest drawing, she asked, "Do you think we could all have the same last name someday?" And Faith's eyes met Leo's across the room. And though they didn't speak, the answer was clear. Maybe not now, but someday. And that someday began to feel closer every day. As fall settled into the city, bringing with it crisp air and golden leaves, Faith and Daisy were adjusting to their new life in Leo's mansion. But what made it feel like home wasn't the luxury or the space. It was the warmth that grew between them, day by day. Their lives blended not through grand gestures, but in small, consistent moments. Daisy racing down the hall, barefoot, dragging Leo into a tea party with stuffed animals. Faith humming in the kitchen, while Leo leaned against the doorway, sipping coffee, watching her, the same way someone watches the sunrise with quiet reverence, and a sense that something sacred is unfolding. And yet, even as they embraced this new rhythm, the past had a way of lingering. Faith was still wrestling with years of disappointment and betrayal, learning to believe that change was real, that love could return not as a fantasy, but as something dependable. And Leo knew he had to keep earning that belief, not with apologies, but with accountability. And here's where real-life reflection makes the story even more meaningful in many blended families. The healing doesn't come quickly. It's built one honest conversation at a time, like the story of Jason and Maria from Oregon. Jason abandoned Maria when she was pregnant, consumed by addiction and self-hatred. 10 years later, after turning his life around, he found them again, not to disrupt, but to offer support. And now, years later, they co-parent peacefully with love and respect. Because redemption is not about rewriting history. It's about building a future that honors what was lost. And that's what Leo and Faith were doing every day. And as the holidays approached, Daisy's excitement became contagious. She'd never had a Christmas tree or wrapped a gift for someone. She loved so when Leo brought home a towering pine tree and set it in the grand hall. Daisy squealed with delight. She decorated it with everything from golden stars to mismatched socks, and Leo didn't care. He loved it because it was hers. Their first Christmas together was simple but magical, no lavish party. Just the three of them exchanging handmade gifts under the twinkling lights. Faith gave Leo a framed picture of Daisy's first drawing of their family. Leo gave Faith a locket with a photo of all three of them inside, and Daisy gave each of them a handwritten promise to love them forever. And that night, as snow fell softly outside, they sat together by the fireplace, and Faith whispered, "I never thought we'd get here." And Leo took her hand and replied, "We're just getting started." And from that night forward, everything deepened. Faith started to trust Leo with her fears, her hopes, her heart, and Leo opened up in return about his regrets, his loneliness, the pressure he'd felt to succeed at all costs, and the emptiness that came when he realized success meant nothing without someone to share it with. And those late-night talks became their sanctuary, a place where truth was welcomed and vulnerability was safe. And that's something more people need to understand. Emotional intimacy isn't built on perfection. It's built on presence. And when we're brave enough to share the parts of ourselves we fear will drive others away, we often find that love leans in, closer, not further. And Daisy thrived in that environment. Her grades soared, her confidence blossomed, and her laughter echoed through the halls like music. And one day after school, she ran to Leo, clutching a certificate. "I won first place in the poetry contest," she shouted, and Leo knelt down, scooped her into his arms, and whispered, "I'm so proud of you." And when Faith joined them, smiling with tears in her eyes, Daisy handed her the poem, titled Home is Where My Heart Is. And that poem was more than a ribbon or award. It was a declaration, a celebration of the life they had created together. And as winter faded into spring, Leo began planning something special, not to impress but to express his commitment. One evening, he took Faith to the garden under the blossoming cherry trees, where candles lit the path and soft music played, and they're surrounded by memories and new beginnings. He knelt down and asked her to marry him. Not because it would fix everything, but because it meant he was choosing her fully, publicly, and forever. And Faith didn't answer right away. She looked at Daisy, who had crept into the garden holding a bouquet of wildflowers. And then she looked back at Leo, her voice trembling, as she said, "Only if we promise to keep choosing each other, even when it's hard." And Leo nodded yes every single day. And they embraced under the stars with Daisy spinning around them laughing. And in that moment, a new chapter began, not built on fairy tales, but on truth growth and the promise of unconditional love. The wedding wasn't grand by society's standards, but it was perfect in every way that mattered. It took place in the same garden where Leo had proposed, the trees still blooming, the lanterns still glowing, but now filled with people who had come not for a spectacle, but for a celebration of a love that had survived the storm. Daisy served as flower girl, twirling down the aisle, tossing petals with joyful abandon, while Faith walked arm in arm with her childhood friend, wearing a dress stitched by hand, not to show off, but to reflect the journey she had walked. Leo stood waiting, not in a designer tux, but in a tailored suit that Faith had picked out, quietly proud and deeply moved. And when they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden, because their words weren't poetic promises crafted for an audience. They were honest affirmations spoken from the depths of two hearts that had broken and healed and chosen each other anyway. I vow to stay even when it's easier to walk. I vow to listen even when I don't understand. I vow to love you, not because of who you were or who you will be, but because of who you are right now. These were the words that held more weight than diamonds, and as they kissed, Daisy shouted finally, and the entire garden burst into laughter and applause. And what followed wasn't a reception, but a gathering, a community of neighbors, colleagues, and friends who had watched their journey and now danced with them under string lights and moonlight and love. And as the music played, Leo took Daisy's hand, twirled her once, and whispered, "Thank you for running to me that day." And Daisy grinned. "I told you you looked like a dad." And here's what we learned from this chapter of their story. Love isn't about how it begins. It's about how it grows. It's not about perfection or timing or even destiny. It's about the daily decision to show up, to forgive, to stay, and to believe that something beautiful can rise from the ashes of broken beginnings. The weeks after the wedding brought a kind of peace that Leo had never known before. His home, once quiet and cold, now pulsed with energy and warmth. Faith's laughter in the kitchen, Daisy's footsteps racing down the stairs, Leo's gentle goodnight kisses, each one a thread in the fabric of a family that had fought to be whole, and they began planning their future. Not around success or status, but around presence, like starting a reading hour at Daisy's school, to encourage other kids from tough backgrounds, or working with shelters to provide safe spaces for single mothers. And here's a real-world example that resonates with this part of the story. In Atlanta, a couple who met while volunteering at a soup kitchen now run an organization that helps reintegrate homeless families into society, not by just giving them housing, but by offering mentorship, love, and consistent emotional support, because real transformation isn't about fixing people, it's about walking with them. And that's what Leo and Faith committed to doing, not just for each other, but for their community. And Daisy was at the center of it all. Her confidence grew, her empathy deepened. She began organizing toy drives, writing poems for families in need, and even started a school project called Run Toward Love, inspired by her own story, where students shared moments they chose kindness over judgment. And her teacher said it best: she's not just a bright student, she's a beacon. And Leo, watching her speak in front of her class, knew that while he had built companies and earned billions, nothing compared to the legacy of watching his daughter grow into someone who made the world better simply by being in it. And one quiet night, as the three of them sat around a bonfire roasting marshmallows, Daisy asked a question that made them pause. If I never ran up to you that day, would we still be a family? And Faith looked at her, smiled softly, and said, I think the universe was always trying to bring us together, and you were just brave enough to say hello first. And Leo added, sometimes the smallest step you take becomes the biggest moment of your life. Daisy nodded satisfied and went back to burning her marshmallow until it caught fire, and the night erupted in laughter. And here's the final takeaway from their journey. Your story isn't defined by its beginning. It's defined by what you do when given the chance to rewrite it. Leo once made a mistake that cost him years with his daughter. But when life offered him a second chance, he took it not because he was ready, but because he was willing. And that's all it takes, a willingness to change, to show up, and to keep walking, even when the road is uncertain. And Faith didn't forgive him. All at once, she took her time, set boundaries, honored her pain, and slowly allowed love to grow again. And that process, not the picture-perfect outcome, is what made their love so unbreakable. And Daisy, she reminded everyone that children have a way of seeing the truth that adults often hide from. And sometimes all it takes is one brave heart running toward what feels right to change everything. And as their story continues, they carry these lessons not as burdens, but as blessings. Proof that love can begin with chaos, heal through grace, and thrive through commitment. And if you find yourself today standing at the edge of a decision, unsure if it's worth the risk, let this be your reminder. Some of life's most beautiful moments begin with a leap of faith.